Welcome back, students. This is another important question, and this is for the vertebral artery. The question is, describe the vertebral artery and its branches. Okay. In the description of vertebral artery, we will see its extent. Then we will see the parts of the vertebral artery, and along with that we will see its relation, and then we will come to the branches of this vertebral artery, and lastly we will learn about its applied importance or clinical significance. So the answer is the vertebral artery is a branch of the first part of the subclavian artery, both on right side as well as on the left side. Okay. Now this artery is mainly responsible to supply the blood to the brain, okay, along with the internal carotid artery. So both arteries, internal carotid and the vertebral artery, they will supply the blood to the brain, okay, and they are also responsible, internal carotid and vertebral, after further division to form the circle of Willis, which is a hexagonal circle at the base of the brain to supply the blood. Okay. Now let us first see this diagram which I have drawn for you in the whole extent of the vertebral artery. Let us see here. Now this is the midbrain, this is the pons, and this is the medulla, and below this medulla this is the cervical part of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the brain stem and then the part of the cervical part of the spinal cord. Let us see the other end of this diagram. In the other end of this diagram, as it is extending, this is the arch of aorta. Let me write here, arch of aorta. This is the arch of aorta, and the first branch which takes origin from the arch of aorta, it is the brachiocephalic trunk. Brachiocephalic trunk. Okay. Now this brachiocephalic trunk, soon posterior to the sternoclavicular joint, okay, on the right side, will divide into two terminal branches. One will ascend up into the neck. Soon it will be under the within the carotid sheath, and it is the common carotid artery. This is the common carotid artery, okay, which will be running then into the within the carotid sheath. Then the other branch which is taking origin here, the terminal, this is the right subclavian artery. So this is the right subclavian and the common carotid artery, and arising from the right subclavian artery, okay, from its the first branch, as the first branch which will go upward and medially, it is the vertebral artery. So this is that origin, vertebral artery is here. Okay, I hope no problem. Here it is on to the left side. This is the common carotid artery of left side, and this is the subclavian artery of left side. And again from here, the first part of this artery, subclavian, will give the vertebral artery here on this side, onto the left side, okay, onto. But this origin is from the subclavian artery, where it lies, okay, again posterior to the sternoclavicular joint, okay, posterior to the sternoclavicular joint. Okay, so now you have seen that how the vertebral artery from two sides will arise from the subclavian artery. Right. Let us come to again the description of the this vertebral artery. Okay. Now this vertebral artery, as I have shown you in that diagram, it begins at the root of the neck and terminate in the posterior cranial fossa by joining the vertebral artery of the opposite side to form the basilar artery. That I will explain. Now this vertebral artery then passes through the neck, then it comes into the cranial fossa, that is the posterior cranial fossa. It lies on the anterolateral side of the medulla, and at the lower margin of the pons it will unite with its fellow, means of the vertebral artery of the opposite side. So this is artery of the right side and this is artery of the left side, and here they unite to form a single artery which is called as basilar artery. So right and left vertebral artery at the lower margin of the pons will form the basilar artery. So you can consider at the lower margin or lower border of pons, this is the termination of the vertebral artery, and from where it has begun? It has begun on the subclavian artery. Okay, quite low. So it has a long course. Okay, first it runs at from the root of the neck, it goes into the cranial cavity and it lies in front of the medulla, and just at the lower margin of the pons it terminates. So it has a very long course, that is the vertebral artery. Right, now as it ends or terminates as the basilar artery by joining with its opposite vertebral artery. The course of the artery, since it is a very long artery running in from the root of the neck, then in the whole length of the neck, and then into the cranial cavity also, posterior cranial fossa also. So this artery, so it is so lengthy that it is, for the descriptive purpose, it is divided into the four part. Okay, into the four part, and this part are given the name as the first part, second part, third part, and the fourth part. Okay, so these four part I will show you in this diagram. To begin here, the first part of the vertebral artery, which takes origin from the first part of the subclavian at the root of the neck, this will arise here, and then it will runs upward and slightly medially to enter in the foramina transversarium of the C6 vertebra, that means cervical sixth vertebra. See this is the body, lamina, spine, foramina transversarium in the transverse process is here. So this artery will not go through the foramina transversarium of the 7th cervical, but it will pass in front of that and little away, and then it goes from the under surface of this transverse process. It will just pass through this foramina transversarium and it ascend up. Okay, it will ascend up. So till it goes through the foramina transversarium of the 6th cervical vertebrae, this is the first part of the vertebral artery. Okay, it is the first part of the vertebral artery. At its origin, okay, this artery lies between scalenus anterior and longus colli. Okay, longus colli is medially placed and scalenus anterior is on the lateral side of this vertebral artery. So this artery, the first part, lies between the two muscles, longus colli, which is just in front of the vertebral column, cervical part of the vertebral column, and then it is laterally, it is in relation to that of the scalenus anterior muscle, and the gap between these two muscles is known as the space or the triangle of the vertebral artery. This is called as triangle of the vertebral artery. So at the root of this, okay, neck, in the front, I'm say the first part of the vertebral artery anteriorly is related to the common carotid artery. See this common carotid? This artery, common carotid, will lie in front of this vertebral artery. I have drawn though at a distance, but they are very close to each other. So the common carotid artery on the right as well as onto the left side will then cover to the first part of the vertebral artery anteriorly, and it is here now lying within the carotid sheath. So it is the medial part of the carotid sheath in which lies the artery that will come in front of anterior relation. Okay, now this artery anteriorly will also be crossed by that of the inferior thyroid artery, which takes origin from the third branch from the first part of the subclavian thyrocervical trunk, thyro. So the inferior thyroid branch will go towards the lower end of the thyroid artery. Okay, I mean say thyroid gland. Okay, it will go, and then this artery will pass from lateral to medial side. So these are the anterior relation of the first part of the vertebral artery. Okay, let us come to the second part of the vertebral artery, and second part, it lies within the foramina transverse area from C6 so to C1 vertebra. See in this diagram. Okay, this is the foramina transverse area of C6. As you will trace this artery, it will then pass through the foramina of C5 transverse process, C4, C3, C2, and then it will deviate towards the lateral side to pass through the foramina transversorium of the C1, that is cervical first, that is the atlas vertebra. And why it will have to go little laterally? Because the C1 is the widest cervical vertebrae. That means its length between the tips of the two transverse process is much more than the rest of the transverse process. That means rest of the vertebrae. Okay, but when you measure the distance between right and left cervical transverse process of these vertebrae, so it will just go little upward and laterally to enter inside the foramina transversarium of the atlas or the C1. Okay, C1. So right from C6 to that of the C1, this is the second part of the vertebral artery. This is the second part of the vertebral artery. And second part of the vertebral artery is surrounded by the sympathetic plexus and now plexus, which is forming a very fine plexus and surrounding the surface of this second part of the vertebral artery. Okay. Now this is also surrounded by a plexus of vein, which later on will form the vertebral vein. It will form the vertebral vein which will go down. So a plexus is there, not the vertebral vein proper, but from this plexus the vertebral vein will arise. So there are two structures which are surrounding to this second part of the vertebral artery while it is traversing between C6 to C1 through their foramina transversarium on right as well as the left side. These are the sympathetic nerve plexus and the venous plexus Now at each vertebral level, this artery, that is, it will lie anterior to the ventral ramus of the cervical nerve. The cervical will come out from here, will be C2, C3, C4, C5, C6. Okay, and these are the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. And this ventral ramus of the spinal nerve, they are going posterior. That means the artery is lying anterior. Okay, artery lies anterior to the ventral rami of these cervical nerves, which are coming out from spinal cord and then going to the neck. Okay, and this ventral rami of cervical nerve will form the two plexus in this region, a cervical plexus and the part of the lumbar plexus. I'm sorry, not lumbar. Brachial plexus. It will form the brachial plexus. So these are the first and second part of the vertebral artery. Let us come to the third part of the vertebral artery, and it lies in the suboccipital triangle, where it comes out from the C1 foramina transversarium. Then it runs on to the surface of the C1 vertebrae transversely and then forms a loop and goes through the foramina magnum, by the side of the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, and then it enters inside the foramina magnum, where it pierces the dura and arachnoid matter. Okay, so this is the third part. So after coming out from the foramina transversarium of atlas, it will wind round the lateral mass of the atlas. I have drawn a separate diagram where you are seeing the atlas vertebra from top. This is the tip of the transverse process of the atlas vertebra. This is the articular surface or articular facet, which will form a joint with the occipital condyle of the skull, atlanto-occipital joint. Okay, and this is the anterior arch of the atlas, and this is the posterior arch of the atlas. After coming out through the foramina transverse areum, this is the third part of the vertebral artery. First, it will lie posterior to this articular mass, okay, this articular mass, and then which is called as lateral mass of the atlas, and then it will lie on the posterior arch of the atlas, okay, superior surface of the posterior arch of the atlas, and then this artery will leave the triangle. At this level there will be the occipital triangle. So this part lies within the occipital triangle as the content of the occipital triangle. Then this artery will leave the occipital triangle, okay, just lateral to the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, just lateral to the posterior atlanto-occipital membrane, and then it will enter inside the cranial cavity, okay, inside the cranial cavity. Okay, now let us come to the fourth part. Now fourth part is actually which enters the cranial cavity, okay, this is the fourth part here. See, from this loop-like structure, okay, right up to the lower margin of the pons, right up to here, from here to here, this is the fourth part. This is from loop, this is the fourth part, right from here, and I will just write here. So this to this, it is the fourth part. It enters the cranial cavity through the foramina magnum after piercing the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. What does it mean? It means now this artery, fourth part of the vertebral artery, is in the subdural space between the pia and arachnoid mater, bath with the cerebrospinal fluid, okay. Now at the lower margin of the pons, right and left vertebral artery, they will join with each other in the midline and will form a single artery, what is called as the basilar artery, okay, which lies on the ventral aspect of the pons, ventral. So this is how the long course of the vertebral artery in the fourth part is seen here, okay. So try to remember this diagram which tells you about the third relation of the third part in the with the superior surface of the atlas vertebra, where it on the posterior arch of the atlas it lies in a groove before it goes inside the inside the dura mater, okay, where it before it pierces the dura mater, right. So I hope that you have understood the course, okay, and the parts of the vertebral artery. It is quite a long artery, and since it is a long artery, it is well protected within the foramina transverse aurium of the transverse process of this cervical vertebrae from C6 to C7. But remember that this artery don't pierce or don't passes through the foramina transverse aurium of the 7th, okay. It is not going through the 7th. Let us come to the branches of this artery, the vertebral artery. Okay, now the second part of the vertebral artery, it gives many spinal branches, okay, and these spinal branches, they are taking origin from the second part. See, these are all spinal, and from there where they are coming, where the artery is lying, passing through foramina transverse aurium, in between the two transverse process, at least one artery is given in these different levels, okay, and this is called as the spinal branch of the vertebral artery, which will go into the vertebral canal. And how it will go into the vertebral canal? After taking its origin, it will go through the intervertebral foramina, and then it will come to lie, okay, after piercing the dura mater, arachnoid mater, it will lie on the surface of the spinal cord. Let us see here, okay, let us see here. See this spinal branch, okay, and this is the cross section of the spinal cord, anterior horn, and this is the posterior horn, white matter, anterior median fissure, posterior median septum, and this spinal branch, as it will come near the spinal cord in subarachnoid space, then it will divide into two. That means the anterior branch and the posterior branch. Anterior branch will anastomose with already an anterior spinal artery which is running vertical here in front of the spinal cord. This is anterior spinal artery which is running in front of the spinal cord. And how this anterior spinal single artery running in front of the spinal cord or in the fissure, this is formed by the branches arising from the right and left vertebral artery, and then it comes to run in front first into the medulla oblongata and then to the cervical part of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is how the spinal branch will be anastomosing with the anterior spinal artery at each level from right and left side. The posterior branch of this spinal artery will go towards this is posterolateral sulcus, where the posterior root of the spinal nerve is present, and then it will form two longitudinal channels on either side of the posterior root of the spinal nerve, one medial to this and another lateral to this, which are intercommunicating with each other. Okay, so this will be the posterior spinal arteries. So they are two posterior. Okay, and this is the anterior spinal artery. Okay, right. Then from the third part, there will come out many branches, very small branches, where it is lying into the suboccipital triangle, as I said it. And these are the muscular branches which will be given to the rectus, capitis, posterior, major, minor, superior oblique, inferior oblique, and these muscles, which forms the boundary of the suboccipital triangle, they will be supplied by this branch. Okay, this is the muscular branch. I will just name it. Is just only one I have drawn. Muscular branch in the suboccipital triangle. Now this posterior spinal artery and anterior spinal artery, see here, two posterior spinal and one anterior spinal artery are given in the cranial cavity. See how they are given in these branches. They will go down and will supply. This is the anterior spinal artery, okay, which will unite to form a single, and this is the posterior spinal artery which will go on posterolateral aspect of the spinal cord, and then it will form the vertical channels. One more artery where it is the fourth part of the is important artery, thick, quite thick, from the fourth part is given, and this is called as the posterior inferior cerebellar, not cerebral, cerebellar. Okay, that means it will supply the inferior surface in its posterior part of the cerebellum, because there is another artery which will arise from this basilar artery, from which will be called as the anterior inferior cerebellar. That's why this is posterior inferior cerebellar, and it will supply to the cerebellum. Okay, so these are the various branches of the vertebral artery. Okay, various branches of this completes the relations, the course, the branches, and lastly we come to that of the applied anatomy. And in applied anatomy, okay, this is the second part, may be praised by osteophytes in cervical spondylosis. That is the old age changes. Okay, a person when become old, then the bony spicules or bony extra bones, they start coming from the near, especially near close to the foramina. So close to this foramina of the foramina transversarium, the bony scipules or the foramina become narrow because of the excessive deposition of bone in the margin of foramina, and these are called as the osteophytes. They are called as the osteophytes, and this osteophyte will press on to this vertebral artery. So the flow of the blood through this vertebral artery will become sluggish or slow, and sometimes this will result in the less supply of the blood to that of the brain, okay, to the brain stem mostly, where it is supplying through the basilar artery, okay, and this will result, okay, compression of this blood vessels may result for transient stoppage of the blood, okay, to these areas of the brain stem, and this may cause the transient ischemia. Ischemia means where the lack of the blood supply or less blood supply is that, and this will result into the dizziness. Dizziness means chakkar in Hindi. Okay, this will lead to, okay, where you are not, I mean to say, fully conscious about your positions. You are feeling dizzy. Okay, dizziness, it is called as dizziness, and this is due to the osteophytes pressing onto the, especially the second part of the vertebral artery, which has to pass through foramina transversorium. Now, and another applied importance is that as the age advances, the lumen of this vertebral artery becomes narrow because of the deposition of the fibrofatty tissue deep to the tunica intima, that is just deep to the lumen endothelial lining. Okay, and that this leads to the narrowing of the vertebral artery, and again the same result. Okay, this will again inadequate blood supply will be there from the third and the fourth part also. Okay, where the atheroma or depositions are more common in third part and the fourth part, and again the dizziness, less blood supply, okay, going to the brain stem. Okay, now sometime what happens that since this the third part is passing from foramina transversarium and then going into the see here, then it is going into the cranial cavity. Okay, so this is a long tortuous artery, and lying here onto the I mean say posterior arch of the atlas vertebra. And if you are turning your head excessively, as in case of when you are driving a car and you want to take the reverse, you have to see backward. Okay, and at that time you are turning your head quite excessive, and in that condition the third part of the artery may get stretched. Okay, it may get stretched, and there may be the occlusion of the blood flow through the foramina transversarium of the C1. Again the same result will be there. Okay, this will again lead to the dizziness. Okay, dizziness. So this is the about the vertebral artery. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video.